The wind came down from the Rockies like something alive and angry. It tore across the frozen plains of Colorado on the night of December 24th, 1887, rattling every shutter, howling through every crack, and burying the little frontier town under a silence so thick it felt like the world itself had forgotten to breathe. The Christmas bells of St. Chapel rang once at dusk, then went quiet, as if even the bell ringer had surrendered to the cold and gone home. Nobody was outside. Nobody, that is, except the wind and the memory of a woman who used to matter in this town. Beneath the crumbling ranch house, 12 feet underground, sat with her back against a wall of cold stone and her knees pulled tight to her chest. She was 29 years old. She had cheekbones that could cut glass, dark copper hair that fell in loose waves past her shoulders, and green eyes that still carried the particular light of a woman who had been well loved once. She wore a navy wool dress that had been elegant 8 months ago and was now frayed at the cuffs and patched at the hem. Over it she had layered a man's old riding coat too large for her frame, smelling faintly still of leather and pine, and the ghost of a life she no longer lived. One candle burned on the dirt floor beside her. That was all she had. One candle, one thin blanket, the riding coat, and a silence so profound she could hear her own heartbeat measuring out the minutes of Christmas Eve like a clock that didn't care. She had not eaten in 2 days. Not for lack of pride, had more pride than was perhaps wise for a woman in her situation. She had not eaten because there was nothing to eat. The kitchen upstairs was no longer hers to use. The parlor, the bedroom, the dining room with its long oak table where she and had hosted half the county for Sunday dinners, none of it was hers anymore. Sheriff Wade Boone had seen to that. 3 months after his death in April, Boone had arrived at her door with a leather folder full of documents she didn't fully understand: debt notices, land liens, loan agreements bearing her late husband's signature. He had been almost polite about it, which was worse somehow than cruelty. He had a thin smile and pale blue eyes that never quite warmed, and he had told her, in a voice like a door closing slowly, that the property was being held as collateral against outstanding debts owed to the Territorial Bank. She had argued, she had demanded a lawyer, she had written 3 letters to the county seat that were never answered. And then, one cold November morning, Boone's deputy had changed the locks on the upper floors. They had left her the cellar, as if it were a kindness. Exhaled slowly, watching her breath bloom and vanish in the candlelight. She thought about going upstairs and pounding on the locked door until someone heard her. She had done it before in the early weeks. The deputy would open it, look at her with dull eyes, and tell her the sheriff's orders were the sheriff's orders. She had stopped going upstairs. She had stopped a lot of things that felt like begging. Instead, she reached beside her and pulled her old saddlebag into her lap. It was worn brown leather, cracked at the corners, with a brass buckle that had gone green with age. She carried it everywhere now, not because it was practical, but because holding it felt like holding his hand. Inside were the small remnants of him she hadn't been able to let go: a folded map of Colorado he'd drawn himself, a pocket watch with a cracked face, a sprig of dried lavender she had tucked in there herself the morning they buried him. And beneath all of it, wedged flat against the bottom seam, a letter. She had found it 6 weeks after his death, tucked inside a hidden panel she'd discovered only by accident when the stitching had come loose. It was sealed with dark wax, no emblem, no mark. On the front, in deliberate handwriting, were 7 words that had kept her awake on more nights than she could count. To the man who finds her first. She had turned it over 100 times. She had held it to candlelight. She had almost opened it on 3 separate occasions and stopped herself each time, though she could not have explained exactly why. It felt like it wasn't meant for her, like opening it before the right moment would break something she couldn't name. She set it gently back in the saddlebag and closed the buckle. Outside, the storm deepened. Drew the blanket, leaned her head back against the cold stone, and closed her eyes. She did not cry. She had made herself a promise in the early dark weeks of grief that she would not cry on Christmas, not this year, not in a cellar, not alone. Instead, she whispered a prayer into the flickering dark. Not for rescue, not for the ranch or the debts or the locked doors above her head. Just for one warm meal. Just for that. The candle trembled. And somewhere above the frozen earth, through 2 feet of timber and stone and howling Colorado winter, something knocked. She didn't move at first. Opened her eyes and stared at the ceiling of the cellar, raw timber beams laced with frost, and told herself she had imagined it. The storm played tricks. Wood contracted in the cold and groaned like a living thing. Wind found gaps in stone and whistled through them in shapes that almost sounded human. She had been alone long enough to know that loneliness had its own acoustics. Then it came again. 3 knocks. Slow, deliberate, unhurried. Not the impatient hammering of a deputy or the sharp, authoritative rap of Sheriff Boone. Just 3 quiet knocks, like a man who understood that the person on the other side might need a moment before deciding to answer. Rose to her feet. She moved silently across the dirt floor, candle in hand, and pressed her back flat against the wall beside the cellar door. Her heart was knocking nearly as loud as the stranger outside. She had no weapon. Boone's men had taken the rifle months ago. What she had was stillness, and she used it. "Who's there?" she said, not a question, a test. A pause. Then a voice came through the timber, low, unhurried, with the particular quiet of a man who had learned long ago that raising his voice rarely improved a situation. "Name's Eli Cane, ma'am. I'm a traveler. My horse needed shelter from the storm, and your barn was the closest thing standing. I saw smoke coming up from a vent in the ground and figured I ought to knock rather than wonder." Said nothing. "I'm not armed with anything but cornbread and salt pork," the voice continued, and there was something almost careful in the way he said it, like he was choosing each word with deliberate gentleness. "It's Christmas Eve and it's 30 degrees and I've got more food than one man needs. That's all this is. You don't want to open the door, I understand it completely." Silence. Then, "Merry Christmas, ma'am." Looked down at the candle in her hand. She thought about pride. She thought about the 2 days without food and the cellar and the cold stone wall she had been leaning against for so many weeks it had left a permanent chill in her bones. She thought about the prayer she had whispered not 10 minutes ago into the flickering dark. Just one warm meal, just that. She lifted the iron latch and opened the door. The cold rushed in first, sharp and immediate, carrying snow crystals and the smell of pine and wood smoke. Then the man filled the doorframe, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a heavy canvas duster coated in snow, a dark hat pulled low over his brow. He had a jaw that looked like it had been carved rather than grown, dark eyes that moved across the cellar in a single calm sweep, and the kind of stillness about him that didn't come from laziness but from long practice. He was holding a cloth-wrapped bundle in both hands, offered forward, like a man approaching something he didn't want to startle. Their eyes met. Neither spoke for a moment. Then Eli Cane stepped inside, ducked his head under the low beam, and said simply, "Thank you for opening it." He built the fire without being asked. He found the broken iron brazier in the corner that had given up on weeks ago, examined it briefly, adjusted the damper with 2 precise movements, and had a real fire burning within minutes. Warmth spread through the cellar like something remembered. Sat on the wooden crate she used as a chair and watched him work, saying nothing, her pride and her hunger conducting a quiet negotiation she had already lost. He unwrapped the cornbread and salt pork and set them between them on the flat of his saddlebag without ceremony or comment, then sat back on an upturned crate and waited. She ate slowly at first, then less slowly. He looked at the wall. When she was finished, she folded her hands in her lap and looked at him directly, the way she used to look at men who underestimated her, and said, "I'm not a charity case, Mr. Cane." "No, ma'am," he said. You're a woman who opened a door to a stranger in a blizzard. That's not weakness. That's courage with good judgment attached. Something shifted behind her eyes, not softened exactly, recalibrated. She told him about. She hadn't planned to, but the warmth and the food had loosened something that the cold had held shut for months, and once she began she found she couldn't stop. The death in April, the documents, Boone's thin smile, the locked doors, the cellar. She spoke without tears, with the measured precision of a woman who had already survived the worst of it and was now simply reporting facts. Eli listened, not with the polite half-attention of a man waiting for his turn to speak. He listened, eyes steady, posture still, asking one quiet question every so often that told her he had actually heard the sentence before it. When she finished, the fire crackled between them. "Your husband's name was," Eli said slowly, "not a question." "Yes." Something moved across his face, brief, unguarded, there and gone. "The saddlebag," he said quietly, "is that his?" Looked down at it in her lap. Her fingers found the buckle on instinct. "There's a letter inside," she said, and she didn't know why she was telling him. "It's addressed to, it sounds strange, it's addressed to the man who finds me first." The fire popped. Eli Cane went very still. "Open it," he said. His voice was barely above a whisper. The wax broke cleanly. The paper unfolded in 3 panels, covered in careful hand, and read it aloud because her eyes kept blurring at the edges, and somehow speaking the words made them more real than seeing them alone. Had known he was dying. A heart condition, diagnosed in February, kept secret because he knew would spend whatever time remained trying to save him rather than letting him spend it loving her properly. He had written the letter in March, 1 month before he died, and he had sent a copy to Eli Cane, former U.S. Marshal, the finest man had ever ridden beside, asking him to come to when the winter came and find a woman who would be too proud to ask for help herself. Eli's copy had never arrived. But he had come anyway, drawn by something he hadn't been able to name, a pull toward a town he had no business visiting, on a night he could have stopped anywhere else. He had told himself it was the storm. He had told himself it was the barn. He understood now what it actually was. "He sent you," said. Her voice was steady but only just. "Even from the grave, he sent someone." Eli said nothing for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was rough at the edges in a way it hadn't been before. "Was the best man I ever knew," he said. "I grieved him, ma'am. I genuinely grieved him." She said quietly, "My name is." He looked at her across the firelight. He repeated, like he was placing something carefully down in a permanent spot. Neither of them said anything else for a while. The fire burned. The storm pressed against the walls. And in the warm, unlikely space of a cellar on Christmas Eve, something quiet and true had taken its first breath, not manufactured, not rushed, but real in the way that only the most unexpected things ever truly are. Christmas morning arrived without announcement. No bells this time. No wind. The storm had exhausted itself somewhere in the deep hours before dawn and left behind a silence so complete it had texture, the particular hush of a world freshly buried in snow, where every surface was clean and every edge was soft and the sky above had turned the pale, luminous pink of something just beginning. Woke first. The fire in the brazier had burned down to glowing amber coals. Eli was asleep on the dirt floor with his duster pulled across him, his hat over his face, one arm folded beneath his head, with the practical economy of a man long accustomed to sleeping wherever the ground allowed. She watched him for a moment, the slow rise and fall of his breathing, the absolute stillness of a man at rest, and felt something she hadn't felt inside this cellar in months. Safe. She folded the feeling away carefully, like good paper, and went to tend the coals. Sheriff Wade Boone arrived at 9 o'clock. He came with one deputy and the particular swagger of a man who had never once been contradicted on his own ground. He wore his badge on his coat like a declaration, and carried the leather folder of documents under his arm like a weapon, which was precisely what it was. He crossed the snow-covered yard of the ranch without hurrying, his boots cutting clean dark holes in the white, and he was already reaching for the cellar latch when the door opened from inside. Eli Cane stepped out into the Christmas morning light. Boone stopped. Eli was unhurried. He pulled the cellar door closed behind him, settled his hat onto his head with one hand, and regarded the sheriff across the snow with the calm, level expression of a man who had faced considerably worse than this and found it manageable. He said nothing immediately. He let the silence do its preliminary work. Boone recovered his composure and manufactured a smile. "Don't know you, friend. This is private property under territorial seizure. I'll need you to move along." "I expect you will," Eli said pleasantly. He reached into his duster and produced a leather wallet, worn and dark with age, which he opened and held forward so the badge inside caught the morning light cleanly. "Eli Cane, United States Marshal, 7th District. Badge still active, jurisdiction still valid, and my patience," he said, closing the wallet, "still present but working on it." Boone's smile didn't fall. It simply stopped meaning anything. "Now," Eli continued, his voice remaining perfectly conversational, "I spent last evening listening to a very detailed account of a debt seizure conducted without a judge's written authorization, on the basis of loan documents that were never independently, against a widow who was never provided legal counsel or a formal notice period as required under Colorado territorial law, Section 14. He took one easy step forward. "That's not debt collection, Sheriff. That's fraud dressed in paperwork, and fraud dressed in a badge is the kind I find particularly motivating." The deputy looked at Boone. Boone looked at the badge. The badge did not blink. What happened next took less time than would have expected. The leather folder was surrendered. 2 names were written down, a bank officer and a county clerk who had co-signed fraudulent documents. Boone's voice, which had opened the morning full of authority, had by the end of it lost considerable volume. He left the way dishonest men always leave when genuinely cornered, quickly, and without looking back. The town came alive by midday. Word traveled in the way it always did, from porch to porch, mouth to ear, faster than any horse, and by early afternoon a procession of neighbors had not seen in months was making its way up the snowy path to the ranch. They came with food and firewood and quiet apologies wrapped inside casserole dishes and quilts. Old Mrs. Heller brought a ham. The brothers brought enough split wood to last a month. The schoolteacher, Miss, brought 4 candles and held hands and didn't say anything at all, which was exactly right. The upper floors were unlocked before sundown. Stood in the doorway of her own kitchen for a long moment before walking in, running her hand along the oak table, touching the familiar cold iron of the stove, reacquainting herself with a life that was hers again. Eli stood in the hall and did not follow until she turned and looked at him with an expression that said, clearly and without ambiguity, "You may come in." He came in. Spring arrived in the way it always did in Colorado, abruptly, gloriously, as if the mountains had simply decided winter had gone on long enough. Eli had stayed, first to help restore the ranch, repairing fences, negotiating the return of seized assets, ensuring Boone's replacement was a man worth the badge, then to plant the kitchen garden had designed with precise and determined opinions about where the tomatoes should go. Then simply because every morning he woke up in the barn loft and walked across the yard to the porch where had coffee waiting, and the conversation picked up exactly where it had left the evening before, and there was nowhere on earth he could construct a reasonable argument for being instead. He stopped trying to construct one sometime in early March. On a warm April evening, with the sun going amber and long over the Colorado plains and the smell of new grass rising from the fields, Eli found on the porch. She was reading, her copper hair loose, his old riding coat draped over the back of her chair, kept, always kept, but no longer worn. He sat beside her. He turned his hat in his hands twice, which she had learned was the thing he did when he was organizing words with unusual care. "I'm not a man who speaks in circles," he said. "I know," she said, without looking up from her page. "I'd like to marry you, not because sent me, not because of the winter or the letter or any of it, because every morning I walk across that yard and you've got coffee ready and an argument prepared about something, and I think," he paused, "I think this is exactly where I'm supposed to be, and I'd like it to be permanent." She closed her book. She looked at him, really looked, the way she had across the firelight on Christmas Eve when she had first understood that this man listened with his whole self, and she felt the answer already living in her chest, warm and certain and entirely her own. "Yes," she said simply, "obviously yes." He laughed. It was the best sound the porch had heard in years. They married in June in the yard of the ranch, under a sky so blue it looked invented. The whole town came. Mrs. Heller brought another ham. Miss cried with complete commitment. The new sheriff, an honest one, shook Eli's hand long enough to be meaningful. And on the front door of the ranch, through summer heat and autumn wind and whatever winters were yet to come, a Christmas wreath remained hanging, a little faded now, dry and beloved, because neither of them had ever taken it down, and neither of them ever would. It was, they had agreed without discussion, the night everything began. And some beginnings deserve to stay on the door.